We left off on Tuesday. We talked about a particular speciation event, so a potential new species being formed of European blackcaps, and that was what we spent most of the class talking about. And then we talked about things like allopatric and sympatric speciation and different things that could drive speciation. What we're going to be spending a little bit of time today talking about is a little more on the evidence we have for past speciations and what some of the large-scale driving forces could have been. So really what we talked about on Tuesday was a very small-scale kind of speciation event where very small events are causing very small changes in populations, which occurred over a fairly short period of time. So 30, 40 years, we're seeing some changes within that species. So it was mostly what we have been calling microevolution, which is changes in gene frequencies. What we started talking about kind of the end of class, and what I'm going to talk about again today, is macroevolution. So these are really large changes over a large period of time. And partly why this is important and why this is interesting is that it gives us an understanding of why there's so much diversity there out in the world. So why are there animals and plants and fungi and bacteria, and why are they so drastically different? Why are we nothing like a plant? Why are we nothing like a fungi? Yet, why do we have similar features? Why do we all have mitochondria? Why do we do cell respiration in the same way? So there's a lot of similarities between us, though there's drastic differences between us. So kind of what we've been talking about today is some of the large driving forces over very, very long time scales that have led to some of the diversity that we see. Tuesday, what we'll talk about is how we classify this diversity and how biological classification is based on this evolutionary past, which we're going to be talking about today and which we talked about on Tuesday. So then next Thursday, when we start getting into some of these groups, we're actually going to work our way through the different large categories of biological organisms. So we're going to start with bacteria, then we'll look at algae, then we'll look at land plants, we'll look at fungi, and finally we'll look at animals. We're going to have some idea of how that diversity came about. And that's where we're going with this. So this slide, which you saw the other day, talks about fossils. So fossils are our evidence for what came before us. So what was here on Earth in the past. And we talked about how sedimentary rock lays down layers of sediment that have eventually become rock, gives us kind of a time scale, and the deepest strata, the deepest rock, has the deepest or the oldest fossils. And as time progressed, organisms were found more and more shallow in the ground, and we can actually use this as a way to tell how long ago something existed. And I'm going to show you a slide or two today about how you actually determine the age of a fossil. So one of the things a lot of evolutionary scientists want to know is how fast did evolution occur? So did evolution occur very, very, very slowly over periods of time, or does it occur very rapidly? Is there a long period of time where we have the same species followed by, boom, and a selective event to lead to evolution that happens very quickly? And we talked about a little bit on Tuesday that one of the pieces of evidence that would support the gradual theory is seeing transitional stages over periods of time, and we do have that in some organisms. So we have seen in some organisms gradual transitions from, for instance, a land-dwelling mammal to a whale, and we see these intermediate stages where they still had a lot of the land features, but they had some of the swimming features as well. And we'll talk a little more later on today about how these very complex things actually can evolve in small patches. So there is some evidence of gradual transitions in the fossil record. So there really are two contrasting patterns that could explain the pacing of evolution. Either it can be a gradual pattern in which changes or speciation events occur by steadily accumulation of many, many, many small changes. So very gradually you get this small changes to what we have today. Or there could be what's called punctuated equilibria. Punctuated means that it's got these distinct bursts in which there's long periods where there's really no change, or there's what's called equilibria, there's no change, that's interrupted or punctuated by brief periods of very, very rapid change. So gradual change versus punctuated equilibria are two different ideas about how evolution occurs. And here's what it would look like in graphic form. So punctuated equilibria would be the top graphic here, where you have one species becoming two very distinct species almost immediately, and then a long period of time of equilibrium where there's no change in the species. Whereas a gradual pattern would see a gradual divergence over many, many generations where there's a speciation event followed by a gradual separation of two species until they are very distinct. And so right after the speciation event, there's really not that much difference between the two species, but over time those differences accumulate. That would be a gradual pattern. So in fossil evidence, if we were seeing a punctuated pattern, we'd expect to see one form followed pretty quickly by two very distinct forms in the fossil record, right? Whereas a gradual pattern, we'd expect to see several transitional forms on the way to the very divergent forms. Problem is, so this graphic on the left would support punctuated equilibrium. You have two very distinct forms right next to each other, and it looks like an apparent rapid evolution. The problem is that fossil record is not perfect, and it's likely, or it's possible, and even likely, that there's a large period of time where data is missing in the fossil record. So I was talking about this the other day in my office, that in order for an organism to become a fossil, there's a lot of chance events that has to happen. The organism has to die in a very specific place. So it has to die in a sedimentary area, or it has to die in a tar pit, or it has to die in the Arctic and be quickly covered by ice or something. In order for an organism to be preserved for very, very long times, and up to millions of years, it's very rare. So otherwise, we'd just be completely swamped with fossils. And although we found lots and lots of dinosaur fossils over many, many years, we really haven't found all that many in terms of how many actually existed on Earth, and how many millions of years dinosaurs actually were found on Earth. If you look at the ratio of potential individuals that existed and the number of bones we found, it's pretty rare that we found them. Most animals died and their flesh was eaten and then their bones disintegrated over time and they basically disappeared completely. They were recycled into some other form. It was very rare that something was preserved in the fossil record. So it's very possible that we're seeing what looks like a punctuated equilibria pattern simply because we can't see the transitional stages. This makes it very hard to tell which one it is, right? Unless you see the transitional stages, it could be either. So that's something we don't really know, but still people are trying to support one or the other of the two theories. Okay. So we're going to be looking at macroevolutionary trends over the next few slides for the rest of today. And macroevolutionary trends, so the changes at a huge scale between groups of species, not just individual species separating, but maybe how we have differences between reptiles and mammals and birds and amphibians and things like that, and how we have differences between animals and plants. These are big scale changes, but they happened because microevolutionary changes due to things like mutation, genetic drift, gene flow, and natural selection, the things we've been talking about, have occurred over billions of years, so 3.8 billion years of accumulation of small changes equals very large changes. So the difficulty with this for you, probably, and for me too, is that it's really hard to think in terms of geological time, in terms of millions of years. Because when you put in perspective all of human history, put it into perspective of the time that we're talking about in these next few slides, we barely existed at all. And so it's not surprising that we haven't found much in the fossil record to give us clarity on human evolution, because in terms of geological scale, time frames, human evolution happened in the blink of an eye. And so it would be very, very hard to find lots and lots of evidence. So finding an occasional fossil from an old humanoid species is pretty big news because of this. So, okay. All right. So, so one of the things that's in your book is a giant chart of geological time. Geological time scale will divide Earth's history into consistent sequences of geological periods, and they actually highlight different things that have happened in the past in those periods of time. So this is on page 281 of your text. You have a chart of geological time. Really, and I'm not going to expect you, of course, to know any of these ages or really any of the things that happen here, just really the overall processes that are occurring, that are pushing forth things to change. So this is what geologic time looks like, and you really probably can't read this because it's very small here, but they've put it in big chunks of kind of millions of years, and different things have happened. So the Precambrian, this kind of bottom section, there were very little living organisms present. The Earth is, probably about 4.6 billion years old-ish. And the oldest fossils that we found of prokaryotic organisms are about 3.5 billion years old. So there was a long period of time where there was no life on Earth. Life kind of came about very gradually at first. It was these very prokaryotic organisms, and you don't see any kind of more complex organisms or eukaryotic organisms for another, let's see, 1.5, almost 1.5 billion years. Eventually you start seeing a lot of aquatic organisms, and then we finally start seeing some land organisms fairly recently, really only about 300 million years ago in the Paleozoic region. A lot of the times when you're thinking about ancient things, you're thinking about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were in this Mesozoic region or the Jurassic region, and that was about 200 million years ago. And the dinosaurs went extinct about 65 million years ago, and we're going to talk about that in a minute or so. And then more recent than that, there was a big diversification of mammals, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, that happened more recently. But in terms of the origin of hominid species, so not Homo sapiens, not us particularly, but the genus Homo, so hominid species, that was somewhere between 1.8 and 5 million years ago. So in terms of the age of the Earth, very, very recent, and recent historical time is 0.01 million years ago. So dinosaurs were present on Earth for much more time, much more time than any kind of hominid species was around. So really, it's not surprising we find more bones from them than we do from hominid species or something like that. So how do paleontologists actually know how old things are when they do find a fossil? Well, they use isotopes, and we talked kind of briefly about this in one of the really early chapters. They use carbon, and you may have heard of carbon-14 dating. Carbon comes in different isotopes, and what an isotope is, just to remind you, I think I briefly mentioned it, is different numbers of neutrons that are present inside of an atom of a certain element. So there's carbon-14 versus carbon-12. Carbon-14 has 2 more neutrons than carbon-12. And it turns out that carbon-14, as an organism is alive, carbon-14 is constantly being taken up in small quantities, and carbon-12 is being taken up in larger quantities. So your cells are made up of some carbon-14 and some carbon-12. And you're constantly, as you eat and as you grow and as you repair your cells, you're constantly replacing carbon-14 and carbon-12. Once you die, once an organism dies, the carbon-14 starts to go away, and the carbon-12 remains. So there becomes less carbon-14 per molecule or per atom of carbon-12. So by looking at the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, if something has a fair amount of carbon-14 versus carbon-12, then they didn't die all that long ago. If they have almost no carbon-14 per carbon-12 molecule, then they died a very long time ago. And this shows you that this is percentage of living organism. If it's at 0 times, you have the same ratio as a living organism. If the organism died 5.6 thousand years ago, so 5,600 years ago, then it has about half the amount of carbon-14 of a living organism. And so each 5.6 thousand years, that amount of carbon-14 gets cut in half. So when you have only trace amounts, it might be millions of years old. So this is how those numbers are come up with, and they're able to date these different bones and put them in different locations. Okay. Where am I going? Okay, so millions and millions of years, organisms have been around, and we've had millions of years for small changes to accumulate. So what are some of the big-scale things that have led to speciation events? Well, one of them, which your book goes into a fair amount of detail about, is the fact that the continents weren't where they are today always. So continents are not locked in place. And this is another thing that's hard to imagine because they don't move very rapidly. They move very, very slowly. But if you give them millions of years, there's dramatic changes. And I'm going to show you some pictures of where the continents were. So we now know we're living in North America. South America is right below us. In order to get to Europe, we've got to cross a big ocean. Europe is attached to Asia, and it's attached to Africa and through the Middle East. And we know that Australia is its own separate little island, and that's pretty much how the world is right now, right? Continents were not always like this. They were not always the same number of continents we had. We've had different numbers of land masses over geological time. And as continents are basically, well, the continents are attached to large plates that are pretty much floating on hot, liquid, underlying material called the mantle. And there is some evidence of this that you probably are aware of. So California has a lot of earthquakes. What an earthquake is when 2 neighboring plates are rubbing against each other and moving relative to each other. And if there's a slight shift in the plates relative to each other, that's when you get an earthquake. Right? Also, where you have 2 plates pushing up against each other, you often get mountains formation, because as one plate pushes into the other, it might push it upwards, and that's going to push mountains upwards. So this is why we have fairly large mountains in the west coast of the states. The Appalachian Mountains, on the other hand, are much, much older. They happened when the North American plate squished in or was pushing against the European plate very long time ago, pushed up the Appalachians. They were gigantic mountains at that point, and now it's been so long that they've been worn down over the years by erosion, by wind, by water, and that's why the Rockies are huge, because they're pretty young mountains, and the Appalachians are a fair amount smaller than them. So anywhere you get earthquakes, anywhere you get volcanic eruptions, those are locations that are on these junctures between plates, and anywhere you get mountains as well. So a volcanic eruption is actually that liquid underlying material coming up through the cracks between the two plates. So if we wait millions of years, because California basically sits on the edge of one of those plates, California could be ripped off of North America and end up somewhere else. So that's very possible, but not in your lifetime, in many, many, many years from now. Right? So here's what the plates look like if we were to draw the edges of these plates. So we can see the North American plate and the Juan de Fuca plate, which is just that little thing. The Juan de Fuca plate runs right along California, and that's where we get a lot of those earthquakes. The North American plate is separated from the Caribbean plate, and the South American plate. So those two continents are on separate plates, and those plates are moving relative to each other. Africa has its own plate. Eurasian plate is one large plate. This is why you don't really get earthquakes or volcanoes between Europe and Asia, because they're on one plate. But you will get earthquakes out in the Pacific, out near Japan and out near Australia. And when earthquakes occur in water, that often causes tsunamis. It causes large waves to be formed, and that's why we get tsunamis out here near the Australian plate and the Philippine plate there. India is on its own plate, and it has, in previous iterations of where land was, India was separated from Eurasia, and it's squished in there, and that's why we have the Himalayan mountains right there. So things like Mount Everest, that falls right at the juncture of the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate. So that's where Nepal is, where you get those large, large mountains as India squishes into Eurasia. And you'll probably notice that everywhere you see a plate junction is a location where there's either volcanoes, volcanic islands, earthquakes, or mountain ranges, which is, I think, pretty cool. That can just kind of tell you where a lot of these things are. So then these plates have moved over millions of years. So here, about 251 million years ago, all of Earth's land masses were rotated and squished together into a supercontinent called Pangaea. So 251 million years ago, there was no separation between the continents. So any organisms that lived around 251 million years ago could basically go anywhere on Earth, any of the land on Earth, without having to swim there. They could walk anywhere around there. So there was a lot of interconnection, there was a lot of movement between different species, and they could easily interbreed and mix up. Between 251 million years ago and 135 million years ago, there was a large separation between two of these land masses. They separated into two big land masses, Laurasia and Gondwana. So Pangaea split into north and south land masses, and you can still see the shape. They've kind of drawn it so you can see the shape of Africa and South America, whereas North America and Eurasia were together. So at this point, we now have two land masses, and populations that used to be connected are now separated. So this is ripe for speciation events to occur. You now have two separate lands that is now harder for organisms to go between. From 165 to about 65 million years ago, Laurasia and Gondwana began to separate into what we can recognize as modern continents. You can see that South America split from Africa. North America is still kind of tied to Eurasia, but it's beginning to split. You can see India is an island right there. So we get some interesting things in India that are different from the rest of Eurasia, even though they're now connected. And you can see Australia is down there attached to Antarctica. And then about 10 million years ago, the Himalayas form as India collided with Eurasia, which was about 55 million years ago, starting to push up the Himalayas. And you can see North America and South America now have connected, and you're beginning to see things looking like modern day position of the continents. So what this is called is continental drift. So as the continents rearrange and move around, this is continental drift. So how can continental drift affect species? So in what ways do you think this would affect species in terms of evolution? So what kinds of things are happening?
Separating species that may have started in
Yeah.
one area.
Yeah, so things that used to be connected during Pangea have been separated for millions of years, and you think over millions of years, you're likely to get some speciation events. Even if it's just genetic drift, you've now separated the populations out. And then you separated the continents again. And so you're constantly forming these what are called allopatric conditions where you can get speciation events to occur, right? You're also, what do you think happened when the Himalayas were pushed up? What do you think happened to species that lived in that area? So are they going to be able to live in the same manner they'd been living in if they're now living, 18,000 feet higher? Now, you're creating a drastic change. Looks like a drastic change to us, but it actually is a very gradual change to the organisms living there over many, many millions of years in climate, but you are changing the climate. So even organisms that still are connected now have different habitats. So habitat alteration, climate change, so due to things like the presence or absence of mountain ranges, due to things being on islands, now being connected to mainlands, you're now changing the habitats, you're changing the climate that they might be living in. You are promoting allopatric speciation, so separation of populations allowing for speciation events, and you're also changing species distributions. So kind of an interesting thing for modern day scientists to do is to look for evidence of these past locations, and really partially how we've determined where continents might have been in the past is by looking for similarities. But we see similarities in things like Brazil and West Africa. So you can see in Pangea, South America and Africa are touching. And we actually see similarities in species between Brazil, which is on the eastern coast of South America, and Western Africa. And you'll have species that are more closely related to each other on those two parts of the world than things like North America to South America, because South America and Africa were actually connected for a long period of time, whereas North America and South America have only recently been reconnected to each other. So species in North America and South America are fairly distinct, whereas you might have a lot of similarities between Africa and South America. And we see a lot of similarities between Europe and North America, whereas we're fairly distinct, again, from South America. So because Laurasia was together a lot. So you see these patterns in where they used to be. This also explains Australia. Australia has an absolutely bizarre fauna and flora. And part of it's because Pangea, you can see here in Pangea, this is Australia down in the right here, connected to Antarctica. So that's Australia and that's Antarctica. Once Gondwanaland formed, once it's kind of split up, basically Australia and Antarctica split off, and they've been on their own ever since. So that was 135 million years. Australia has basically been an island. It's been attached to Antarctica, and there's not all that much life in Antarctica. But soon after that, it split off of Antarctica. So Australia, and we're going to talk about this more when we get to the ecology chapter, Australia has species, a ton of species that are not found anywhere else because they've had 135 million years to accumulate changes, to evolve on their own, separate from the rest of the world. So these continental plate tectonic changes explain a lot of the species that we see today. Okay. All right. So here we go. So here's kind of I was just saying this, but plate tectonics helps explain why reptiles in Ghana and Brazil look so similar and how marsupials were free to evolve in isolation in Australia. So marsupials really aren't found anywhere else in the world. So it's a group of mammals. It's like kangaroos. So they have the pouches. Okay. So one of the large things leading to large-scale changes and large-scale patterns that we see in species today was plate tectonics, was continental drift. Another large thing that has driven evolution are mass extinctions. So looking through the fossil record, we've determined that there are many instances where large numbers of species have gone extinct at once. So mass extinction is a period in time when a large number of species cease to exist all at once. So, and over the last 500 million years, there have been 5 of these events, 5 mass extinction events. And here's kind of a graphic of it. So 5 mass extinction events are recorded in the fossil record. You can see one at about 444 million years ago, another one at 359, one at 251, one at 200, and the most recent one at about 65.5 million years ago. Right. So, and you can see that this is a graph of total extinction rate. You see that otherwise, the extinction rate is pretty consistent over time. There's always some species going extinct, but they're punctuated with these mass extinction events over time. And a lot of like what we've actually named different periods of time by are these mass extinction events. So the Paleozoic ended in a mass extinction. The Mesozoic ended in the extinction of most of the dinosaurs. So, and then the Cenozoic is the modern day time. So fossil record, again, reveals that 5 mass extinction events have occurred in the last 540 million years. There was a mass extinction at about the time that the merging continents formed Pangaea. So this is 250 million years ago. And it claimed about 96% of the marine species. So most marine species disappeared about 250 million years ago. So most of the marine species that exist now have speciated since that point, have come to exist at that point. Another extinction period that happened about 65 million years ago in the Cretaceous period included the extinction of pretty much all the dinosaurs except for birds. And it permitted the rise of the mammals. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the consequences of them, but first I want to talk a little bit more about what we know about this last extinction event. So there's been 5 of these that we know of. We know a little bit about what happened in the previous ones by looking at the fossil record, but the most studied extinction event was the extinction of the dinosaurs, and that's probably why you've heard about it before. What have you heard caused the extinction of dinosaurs? Anybody heard? So yeah, meteor shower, right, is the things. I think Jurassic Park probably even talks about it. There's a lot of popular culture surrounding the extinction of the dinosaurs. And one of the most important things about the extinction of dinosaurs 65 million years ago was that it allowed for the radiation of mammals. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So, there's a nice little story about this in your book. And it talks about meteors killing the dinosaurs and the evidence for that and mass extinction. So I just want to go a little bit into it because I think it's a pretty interesting story. So, in a mass extinction event, about 50% or more of Earth's species die out. And of the mass extinction events, those marking the end of the Permian and Cretaceous period have been the most studied. So the first one was the extinction of most of the aquatic animals, and then the Cretaceous one was the extinction of most of the dinosaurs. So what we've observed in the fossil record, and again, this is spelled out pretty nicely in your book, is that about 65 million years ago, there was an overall cooling period where the climate got cooler and cooler. Because of this, the ice caps started enlarging and soaking up a lot of the seawater, so the seas started to recede. And as this happened, many plant species began to die out. So just due to changes in climate, many plant species died out. And when plant species die, there's less food, so a lot of dinosaurs became extinct. So we're going to talk about birds and how birds are a branch off the same part of the tree that had dinosaurs, but most dinosaurs went extinct at that point. And, interesting enough, there was a very thin layer of clay that is rich in iridium, so the element iridium, laid down. So it seems like over large portions of the Earth, there was a thin layer of iridium laid down. So, cooling climate, seas receding, plant species dying out, dinosaurs disappearing, and thin layer of iridium is what we can see in the fossil record. So they can tell all that by the fossil record. The cooling you see by different species that you see and different species assemblages being found in different locations. So the question scientists had that are studying dinosaurs is the iridium layer the result of fallout from a huge cloud of dust that billowed into the atmosphere when a large meteor or asteroid hit Earth? Because this was kind of the hypothesis was that the mass extinction 65 million years ago was caused by the impact of something from outer space. So the impact of a large meteor. And then this, they would predict then that the huge impact of the crater would be found in the right age rock somewhere on the Earth's surface. And this could have led to a large cloud of iridium-rich material filling the Earth. If this happened, it could lower light levels enough on Earth or reflect light energy away enough to cool the climate and to kill off lots of plants, right? So if it was a large enough object, they would be able to see, they would expect to see what they did see. And by searching the Earth for something of the right age, of the right size to explain these observations that they see, we have actually found near the Yucatan Peninsula a huge impact crater that dated from the predicted time, was about the right size, and if a large extraterrestrial object, like a meteor, had created it, it would have created a cloud that could have blocked enough sunlight for enough period of time to change the Earth climate, to kill off a lot of plants, and to lead to a mass extinction of organisms that relied on those plants for survival. And so they're actually, here's kind of a diagram of what might have happened. Large meteor hits the Yucatan Peninsula, fills the Earth with dust, which blocks out the sun, and then as that dust settles, you get that layer of iridium. So that's now the most commonly thought of mechanism for that last extinction. So as for the other extinction events, there are hypotheses for them as well. But regardless, they all cause a large decrease in the number of species that are present on Earth. So why would an extinction event lead to the mammal, kind of the rise of the mammals, we call it? So at the time that dinosaurs existed, most of the Earth was populated by reptilian species. So there were a lot of reptiles of many different shapes and sizes, all the way from very small reptiles up through the gigantic dinosaurs, filling in many different roles, playing many different roles on Earth as large predators, as large herbivores, as detritivores, as scavengers. They filled all these different roles on Earth that now are filled with mammals. So when all those dinosaurs went extinct, there are now lots and lots of available resources for organisms that survived the extinction event. So anything that survived that meteor hit now had lots and lots of resources to play with, and it could lead to what's called adaptive radiation, is an event in which a lineage will rapidly diversify when newly formed species will now evolve different adaptations as they fill vacant ecological roles or niches. So now that there's no large, or there's nothing that's eating all the vegetation, there's now the availability for something that previously was outcompeted in that role to fill that role again. So it's like if all of a sudden everybody retired from their jobs, there'd now be tons of jobs for people to take, right? So this is the theory of what happened post the extinction of the dinosaurs and why mammals now are found all over the Earth in many different roles, many different sizes, all the way up from large carnivores, a lot of the large cats that we find, all the way down to mice and lots of other different roles. And we have different things like flying mammals and swimming mammals and things like that that fill in all these different roles that there weren't at the time of the dinosaurs. At the time of the dinosaurs, there were very few mammals, only a select few species. Okay. So, and if we look at the fossil record and we count the number of mammal species in different lineages over time, we can see that around 65 million years ago, there's a dramatic increase in the number of mammal species. So marsupials, eutherians like bears and zebras, and monotremes, all things that we will eventually talk about later on in this course, really radiated. So especially the marsupials, which were commonly found in Australia, and eutherians, which are found everywhere else. They went from having just a few of each to having many, many, many in modern days, because there are all these roles that have opened up for them to fill. Okay, let's see where I'm going now. Okay, so you might wonder, looking at this, why did eutherians and marsupials diversify like crazy, and now they have 5,000 species of eutherians, whereas monotremes there's only 5 species? Well, a lot of it is right place at right time kind of thing. So the location where these eutherian species were all of a sudden had lots of roles that they could fill, and therefore there were lots of opportunities to specialize. Whereas perhaps where the monotremes were found, things didn't change all that much for them, and there were still only the certain roles that they could find. Okay. Okay, so that's really the end of the section of this chapter, which talks about how these large-scale changes have occurred over time. What I want to talk about now actually in a slightly different location in your chapter. Let me just pull this up. All right, so we're going to kind of switch paces and look at this from a different perspective now, which is the evolution of novelty. So, all right. So, all right, so we know that given selective pressures in different situations that organisms can speciate. We know that things like extinction events open up locations, open up niches, open up roles that species can take and can lead to diversification. We know that geological time, so small things happening over large periods of time, and pressures such as continental drift can lead to speciation events. But I want to go back and talk again a little bit about how changes occur and how new features can evolve. One of the biggest misconceptions in evolution, and one of the things this chapter really focuses on, is that the evolution of complexity is not a goal-oriented thing. So I know there's a comic that I saw on this a number of years ago, which had a picture of a beaver in the forest. And the beaver is looking at a big tree next to him. And he's saying to himself, there's a little thought bubble, it says, chainsaw, 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 chainsaw. And then in the next graphic, he had a chainsaw for an arm. That doesn't happen. So organisms don't evolve things because they desire them, right? We know that evolution happens on things that already exist in nature. And a lot of those things happen due to mutations. So how do mutations lead to changes over time? A lot of it can be traced back to development. And there's a nice part of your textbook that talks about, it's called Evo-Devo, and it's kind of the development, it's called the development and evolutionary novelty. A lot of at least current thought is that novel traits are often a result of small mutations, small changes during development of an organism. So this is just a picture of growth in humans, and it shows like relative size of different features in humans that, when you're a newborn, your head and your torso and your thighs and your calves all take up about equal space. But by the time you're a full adult, your head is only fills up kind of a quarter of that, and your legs take up about half of your body, and kind of the ratios between body parts really change over time. And if you compared this to other organisms, you'd see different patterns. There's other organisms where their torso elongates very rapidly as they grow, or their torso stays really short as they grow, or their head remains very large as they grow. So throughout the development of an organism, any change in the genes that determine growth rate of different body parts can have a drastic change over their lifetime in physical characteristics. So here's an example of two species that actually look pretty similar when they are fetuses, but look drastically different when they're adults. So here is a chimpanzee on the top and a human fetus on the bottom. So the skulls of a chimpanzee fetus and a human fetus actually look pretty similar. There are differences, so I'm not going to say they're exactly the same, but they're pretty similar as a fetus. But if you look at the ratio of the different bone sizes as an adult, the jawbone of a chimpanzee has grown dramatically, whereas a human jawbone has not changed all that much from fetus. The human's skull has remained large, or really gotten large, whereas a chimpanzee's skull is much smaller in relationship to its jawbone as an adult. So an organism's shape partially depends on the relative growth rates of different body parts throughout its development. And you can take things that, as a fetus are pretty much all the same size, and because the growth rate was accelerated in the jaw and slowed down in the skull, you now have a chimpanzee head, whereas in humans, the growth rate might have been slower in the jaw and maybe a little bit faster in the skull, and you now have a very large brain area and a much smaller jaw. Yeah?
Humans are a product of evolution. Why they're still apes?
Because we've speciated. So just like, okay, so the question was, why do things exist after there's been changes? Well, because we are not, it's not ape followed by human. It's not a linear process. It's more like this. So here's a common ancestor to both humans. So there's humans and chimpanzees. And at some point, humans and chimpanzees have separated. So maybe populations were separated, and there was pressure to have a larger jawbone in this group. And so they evolved the larger jawbone, whereas human species evolved a larger skull, maybe. So there's a separation. So just like we were talking about with the European blackcaps, how one population overwinters in Britain, one population overwinters in North Africa, and because of them now having these different pressures, one needs to fly further, whereas one needs to be maneuverable. You're now seeing slight differences between them. Same thing has happened to humans. We're no different than any other organism, is that over time, changes come about. So that's again, it's a really good question because it's highlighting one of the problems in education, and probably something that apparently I have not done a very good job of putting forth, is that a lot of people still think of it as a linear process. They show that, that graphic of the march of man where you have like the ape here and then slightly standing taller and slightly standing taller, and now you have a human like that. That's completely wrong. It's not at all right. It is more like this. So things branch out, and so this is, we're only looking today at this. We don't know what this individual looked like. They looked like something that was, a common ancestor to both of us, right? To both chimpanzees and humans. We're going to get into that a little bit more in probably what we'll talk about on Tuesday. I have a little bit more about that. But all right. But it's a very good question. You should keep thinking about that because that's a common that stems from a common misconception, which we will talk about again as I get forward. Maybe I'll show you that graphic on that before we finish today. Just have to remember to do that. Okay. So, but before we get into that material, just want to continue on this thought train before I lose it. So evolutionary transitions can be due to changes in developmental timing, and that's kind of what I'm getting at here, is that when different genes turn on, which cause growth in certain parts of the body, that can lead to differences in organisms. And if that change is an advantage, it's going to perpetuate. If that change is a disadvantage, it's not going to be found very often. And as long as there's something separating them, some kind of allopatric situation, you can get speciation events. So, yeah, I'll definitely go to that thought before we end today. But kind of what this leads to is this one kind of topic that certain scientists in quotations maybe, have used as a reason for them not accepting evolution, which is a very bad reason for not accepting it. They say, so there's this example, I think it was this professor from Lehigh University who went on this kick about it. He said, I think it was like a stapler he was talking about. He was like, so how could you design a stapler by small changes. A stapler is a beautiful thing that has many, many working parts that all work together in a certain way to function in the way that it does, and you couldn't just gradually make that happen. Whereas in fact, yes, you totally could. You could gradually make it happen through a series of very small things. So complex things are not evidence that evolution never happened. Complex things, or complexity, is a result of very many small changes occurring over long periods of time. And again, the reason why we have trouble thinking about evolution is that we have trouble thinking in terms of geological time in a lot of things. So even large changes can result from gradual modification of existing structures or slight modifications of developmental genes. So I have kind of two examples that I'm going to go into. First one is eyesight. So you can see these organisms, many different organisms, have beautiful eyes, and we have beautiful eyes, whereas the organisms that we have evolved from didn't have eyes. So if we think about bacteria, we think about a lot of aquatic plants and things like that were around millions of years before any animals existed. They didn't have eyes. So how did eyes come about? Eyes are beautifully intricate. They have lots of parts to them that have to work together in perfect harmony for us to be able to see things and for us to be able to have vision. Well, we actually, if we look at many different organisms, we can see a range of complexity from very, very simple things in some organisms like mollusks, clams, and squids, etc., where we have just a patch of light responsive cells. So there are organisms that don't have eyes like us, but they do have patches of cells that can respond to light. We even have, there's single-celled organisms like euglenoids that have, what we call them eye spots sometimes, but they really are nothing like our eyes. They're a patch of cells that can tell when there's a shadow over it, and what often happens if it's like a photosynthetic organism is that it moves then. It moves into the light, and when it senses light, it now will stay there. And so it's just a patch of pigments. That's A. Then there are some that have an eye cup. So it's just that patch of pigment that has been folded a little bit. And what that folding does is it allows it to now get light from many different directions. So that was an advantage to have, instead of having a flat patch of cells, to have a curved patch of cells. That was an advantage for some organisms because they can now respond to light from different directions. They might be able to tell which direction the light is coming from by which cells were hit by light, and they could then turn their body towards the light. Rather than just randomly moving until there's light in front of them, they can now rotate in the direction the light came from by having that patch of cells curved. So then maybe that patch of cells was sealed off and filled with fluid. And now this fluid allows this organism to maybe focus the light a little better. Maybe it allows it to have, instead of, maybe just allows it to have a much better look at, or more contrast in what it sees. So now instead of just light being present or light being absent, it can see different levels of light, and it can tell some detail about things. And then it's not a far stretch to see that be covered with a cornea or a lens, which helps focus that light and allows it to now see even finer details. And then it's not a huge stretch from that eye with a primitive lens to an eye with a much more complex lens like we have today. So the eye didn't just, boom, come into existence. The eye evolved gradually by small modifications to something like a patch of cells that could sense light and dark. And eventually you now have something that can see complex differences in intensity of light. They can see different colors, different wavelengths, and they can respond to many different things. So, okay, so that's one way things can come about. Organism didn't just say, well, I don't have any eyes, but I want eyes, and then boom, have eyes the next day. It was an organism that had patches of pigmented cells survived more often. And then the organisms whose patch of pigmented cells mutated and was curved shape, that survived more often. And then gradually you got organisms with eyeballs. Okay? So that's one thing. So just kind of to summarize, this isn't how things evolve. Things don't evolve purposefully. It's not goal-oriented. We are not the king of the jungle. It's not like everything aspires to be a human and over time it's going to become us, given enough time. Evolution is like a tree. There's branches out there. We are just one branch on it. There have been many other different areas that have gone. So humans are just one end of a tree. Chimpanzees are another end of the tree. And yes, we had a common ancestor, but we've diverged from them. And that's why we are not chimpanzees. We are humans. And our common ancestor wasn't either of us. It had common themes to both of us, but to both of us and not one or the other. So it wasn't like we were once chimpanzees. We were once something completely different that shared some common characteristics with both us and chimpanzees, right? So we're a tree like this. So I have one other example, and then I'm going to show you another kind of silly graphic that I found on the internet, which I actually modified because I thought it was wrong the way they had it first, is birds. Because I think birds are a really good story, and they tell you about how something can come to be that didn't have the function that it had before. So birds are derived from a lineage of earthbound reptiles. So basically dinosaurs. They are a lineage of dinosaurs. And they evolved flight from flightless ancestors. So birds evolved flight. How did this happen? Did they all of a sudden think, okay, I'm going to sprout wings and start flying? No, that can't happen that way. Oftentimes, things evolve for drastically different purposes than they eventually take on. So it turns out that from our understanding of looking at the different fossil records of ancient bird species, that we think that flight was not the original kind of purpose that wings had. That wings and feathers, they had a completely different function, and it just so happens that birds were able to fly with them, and more flight was an advantage, and that was selected for. So the birds that used their wings to fly were selected for. And we can actually see nowadays there are lots of bird species out there that use wings for different purposes, and we'll talk about that more on Tuesday. So here is an ancient bird. This is an extinct bird species. This is the fossil, and this is an artist's reconstruction. So you can see they take a lot of liberties when they draw these. But they have feathers, they have reptilian teeth, and they have a very long tail that's very reptilian but has some feathers on it. So the thought was that feathers were actually to keep the organism warm for the most part. That feathers didn't evolve for flight. Feathers were kind of for warmth, for the most part. And because some individuals, and you can see this very reptilian-looking bird, some reptiles had lots and lots of feathers on their arms, it turned out that that was actually useful for getting away from predators. So the bird would run away from the predator, and then it would jump and move its arms, and it would get it further away from the predator really fast. So something that evolved for one purpose, for heat, is now being used for something else. And so birds originally couldn't go that far. And we see birds that do this now. So chickens do this. If you see chickens, they run around, and then when they get scared, they flap their wings, and they fly a very short distance, and then they land. You never see flocks of chickens flying overhead, right? Really, it doesn't happen. And there are lots of other things like ostriches as well. They just flap their wings just for short periods of time. The first birds would not have even been able to go that far. They might have just basically been hopping from place to place. But perhaps an individual that was able to stay in the air longer was able to get away from predators more easily, and they survived. And gradually, it evolved to longer and longer and longer flights, and now we have birds that can fly from one pole to the other. So they're able to basically jump, flap their arms, and maintain that jump. So they basically are just good jumpers, and they happen to have these feathers that were for warmth originally that allow them to stay in the air. So this is what's called an Exaptation, it's a structure that evolves in one context but becomes adapted for another function, and it's called evolutionary remodeling. It can account for the evolution of novel structures like wings. So we have two ways that novel structures can evolve. So exaptations, like the bird feathers, and we also have structures that evolve very gradually, like the eyes. Okay. So here's kind of a summary of what I was just saying with the birds. Bird wings are modified forelimbs that were previously adapted for non-flight functions such as thermal regulation, so being able to keep warm. Other ideas for what they might have been for is courtship displays, and a lot of birds do this still now, is that they have, the reason why their feathers are colorful is because it helps them attract a mate, right? Or camouflage. So some birds actually have feather colorations that let them blend into environments. So it might have been camouflage as well. So although this might have driven the evolution of feathers in the first place, eventually some birds began using their feathers to help them glide or extended hops as the animal either pursued prey or fled from predators. And eventually, there was selective pressure now for those that could hop further or glide further or stay in the air longer until you had flight. Okay, so that's okay. So basically, what I've covered today is how evolutionary processes are affected by geological time, processes like geological events like continental drift and mass extinctions, and then how novelty, so new things, can evolve by either gradual processes like the eye or by adaptations of old structures for new functions like bird wings. So I want to end by showing you this last graphic, and I'll probably show you this again on Tuesday, just to kind of clarify and hopefully, because I know lots of people get mixed up with this, and actually, funny thing about this is I first found this graphic on Facebook. So I Fucking Love Science, that website, which has lots of great stuff, posted this graphic, but they had it wrong, I thought. They had the "this is not your family tree, cousin, second cousin, cousin, siblings, you." They had it as grandparents or great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, you. Which actually is your family tree. So you are descended from your parents, and your parents are descended from your grandparents, and your grandparents are descended from your great-grandparents. But the point they wanted to get across is that you are not descended from your siblings, and your siblings are not descended from your cousins, and your cousins are not descended from your second cousins, right? In the same way, you are not descended from a cat, which is descended from a salamander, which is descended from a fish. Or, in other words, you're not descended from a chimpanzee, right? Instead, you are basically a sibling to a chimpanzee. And you might be a sibling to a cat, and you might be a cousin to a salamander, and you might be a second cousin to a fish. You all exist, and you all had a common ancestor. So just like you and your siblings have a common ancestor in your parents, you and your cousins have a common ancestor in your grandparents, and you and your second cousins have a common ancestor in your great-grandparents. You and a cat are both mammals. You have a common ancestor that was a common ancestor to all mammals. You and an amphibian have a common ancestor to four-legged vertebrates, and you and a fish have a common ancestor to all vertebrates. And those common ancestors don't exist anymore. So we don't know exactly what they look like. We might have some ideas. The chances of us actually physically finding a fossil of the exact type of ancestor to all mammals is pretty rare because, again, finding specific fossils is pretty rare. So knowing which exact mammal-like ancestor is the common ancestor to all of us, we're probably not going to know. We can have some ideas by looking at how all the similarities between mammals. We can say a common ancestor of mammals probably had all these features, but we might not know exactly what they are. Just like, let's say your great-grandparents aren't alive anymore, and you don't have any pictures of them, and no one is, and maybe your grandparents aren't alive either, so no one was around that actually knew them. you could get an idea of what they might have looked like by looking at you, your siblings, your cousin, and your second cousins, and thinking about all the common things you have. Maybe your great-grandparents had some of those traits as well, right? We do the same thing in biology. We think about what's common between us and fish. Well, we have mitochondria. We have hearts. We have different kinds of hearts. We have eyeballs. We have all these features. So probably the common ancestor of all vertebrates had a lot of those features too. But they didn't look like us. They didn't look like a fish. They looked like something unique to themselves, just like your great-grandparents don't look exactly like you and don't look exactly like your second cousins, but they have a lot of common features to you. All right? So that's where I'll end it today. I think this is hopefully this is a good explanation of, well, why are monkeys still around? Well, because why are your cousins still around, right? It's the same idea, right? And there's a lot of misconceptions that are perpetuated by lots and lots of people and lots of media as to how this works. But this is a little bit better as to how it works, all right? So leave it there. On Tuesday, we're going to start talking about trees like this and how we put things onto trees like this. And we'll have a little more discussion on what's called systematics. And we'll go into that, okay?